Hello, I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society. Welcome to the Urban Agenda. I'm very pleased to be joined for today's program by two journalists whose reporting about New York City includes a focus upon the poor. Jack Newfield is a longtime investigative reporter and author who has worked at the Village Voice, Daily News, and New York Post, and is now a columnist at the New York Sun. Glenn Thrush has been a City Hall reporter for Newsday for a year, and prior to that was the editor of City Limits magazine, where he covered low-income housing, politics, and child welfare. Welcome to the Urban Agenda.
Glad to be here.
Well, for those of us who claim to represent the poor, the issue of what the media is interested in about poor people, which constitute about 2 million people in the city of New York, is always a great mystery. We know this because we just issued one of our biggest reports in many years at CSS, showing a very high number of black men, for instance, are unemployed. We got great coverage by some of the press, but others, particularly the tabloid press, they didn't even comment upon it. What's going on here? Is this just some of the press just doesn't think real hard news about New York is relevant? Jack?
Well, I think there's been a trend for the last 20 years probably, at least, of the media both moving to the right ideologically through ownership patterns and becoming more and more fixated with gossip, the celebrity culture and trivia, Congressman Condit, celebrity crime waves, Martha Stewart, Michael Jackson's nose.
Yeah, we got bumped by J-Lo and Mothers.
Well, there's this finite space, and these two trends conspire to make poor people, low-wage workers, racism, poverty, a lower and lower priority for most of the media.
You agree to that?
Yeah, generally. I also think getting people depressed doesn't sell newspapers. And to a certain extent, in New York in particular, you have this dynamic with two tabloids that about 10 years ago both nearly went out of business. Yep. And the business model that they adopted is one of sex, gossip, celebrity, and crime. And there really isn't much place in that model for stories that have to do about poor people who are working.
So you don't see this as an editorial effort to switch the news one way or the other. This is more a business issue for them.
I think the two dovetail. I think because the priority of the newspaper business and the media in general has become more business focused, that's dovetailed, I think, with more of an ideological shift to the right. But I think it's primarily a business decision people are making.
Well, if that being the case, is there going to be other media outlets to take some of this up? There are a lot of people, obviously, reading these papers who have some serious things confronting them.
Well, I could only speak autobiographically. Right. After I was fired by Rupert Murdoch for being too liberal, I had to find other places to work, and one was The Nation magazine, right, a liberal/radical weekly, and I've been now the last year, as you know, because you're in it, making a documentary film for public television about poverty in New York City. And I think I've discovered that places like PBS and The Nation are safe havens for people like me who resent authority and want to write about poverty mostly because I grew up in poverty.
But, for instance, is this really reaching to a mass audience? Clearly, The Nation and even PBS to a certain go up fairly high on the income level, though to all races. The question of working people in the city of New York, the working poor in the city of New York, and what they're reading and where their media and news stuff, how are we going to reach that population?
Well, I think
they're the voters, actually.
Well, I think this is a much smaller component of a larger cultural trend. Think about sitcoms on TV. How many, if you remember in the 70s, every sitcom you watched involved people struggling to make it economically. I remember Good Times where people lived in the projects. When was the last time that you saw a TV show in popular culture where someone was living in the projects, someone you were sympathizing with? People have these fantasy lives on TV. Media has become sort of a tool of fantasy, and to a certain extent, TV and newspapers fixate on that because they make their money off of it. So I think to a large measure, part of the problem is selling reality in a culture of fantasy.
It's interesting, however, that people
Which is a great explanation of
Yeah.
the fixation with the celebrity culture.
Right.
People
But
fantasize living like Trump.
like Trump. I get in the Great Depression, obviously, the Busby Berkeley extravaganzas where everyone, the fountains were going.
Right.
Even I just barely remember that, but I still have some,
Did you
on
star in
late-night
a couple of
television.
those?
Right? Yeah, absolutely. I was the girl in the clamshell. But I think one of the things that was interesting is that clearly people have views despite this. We did perhaps one of the largest surveys, phone surveys, of low-income New Yorkers. We were told there hasn't been another one in New York in recent memory or that they could find. And the issues that people understood of, job creation, sort of issues of health care, the lack of education their kids are getting, this is not an unsophisticated audience. So clearly some of the messages are getting through. I guess what's happening is people are just not using newspapers to get it because these were not ill-informed,
Well, they get these priorities from their life experience. They don't have to read a tabloid
Right.
to know that their kid's school is terrible, or they can't afford health care, or they're suffering because they raised the subway fare and the gas price went up. They know it from everyday life.
Well, I guess it's much the same that, you see in the supermarket, everyone sits and, as you're standing in line, reads them, that you're using these kinds of communication mechanisms just for fun, and you don't take them seriously.
Well, I think it also has to do with the pool of people that you're dealing with as subjects, as a journalist.
Right.
I think poverty in the United States has changed over the last 3 and 4 decades, but it's largely been a fairly static institution. Approaches have changed, national attitudes have to some extent changed, but the actual population that you're covering as a reporter has remained fairly static. And I think to a certain extent that's what's kind of been an issue with reporters trying to come up with novel and interesting ways of telling stories that people haven't heard before.
Well, let's talk about what issues do seem to resonate within the tabloid press. Obviously, they haven't shut out everything by any means. For instance, what do you see?
Well, I think the Daily News has done a wonderful job making an increase in the minimum wage to $7.10 an hour by 2006. An institutional priority, both in the news pages and in the editorial columns, and this is wonderful. There are, hundreds of thousands of people living on between $5 and $10 an hour in this city, as you know better than me. And as part of our film on poverty in New York, I'm now following a man who makes $5.15 an hour as a chauffeur driver for the rich and famous, and who lives at 162nd and Broadway, and he has to go back to his apartment, and was almost evicted last month, and recently had to tell his daughter he couldn't afford to buy her eyeglasses.
What about what you see?
I did a story recently focusing on a segment of single women in homeless shelters, and I was really surprised. I was expecting sort of the cookie cutter kind of situation, it's drug dependency, and I came across a tremendous range of people, including this one woman who was actually had 2 and 3 kids in a homeless shelter. She's about 40 years old, and she was commuting to Long Island to work 2 jobs and 50 to 60 hours a week, and she was still sort of so behind the 8 ball she couldn't afford to get housing. So I think the kinds of stories people sympathize with are the kinds of extreme examples of what they themselves are dealing with.
And I must admit, they're out there. There's all sorts of chauvinism that creeps into any profession, and clearly those of us who run not-for-profits serving the poor have our own issues. One of the reasons we did the survey, we were starting to get real queasy. We're making assumptions and assertions about what poor people and working poor people want, and what's your basis? It's because that's the way I remember it, or that's the way I feel, and there has to be some validation here. And I think it's something that our sector has to do, actually, before we even try to convince anybody else. But one of the things that really came out after the attack on the World Trade Center, we began serving low-wage workers. And after meeting some of the low-wage workers who got displaced, the notion of hard work is just, we met sort of my poster person for this was a 76-year-old guy who basically was a messenger. And he was working for a firm that had a little sort of shoebox office at one of the towers. They kept his pay. He was all in cash kind of thing. And the office ceased to exist. And so did his livelihood. And so did all his records of employment. And basically, he was on the verge of losing the little SRO apartment he had. But this guy was working, 50, 60-hour weeks as a matter of course. I joked with him. I said, you're not a bicycle messenger. No, he said he rode the subway. But he had been working basically since the time he first came to this country, you know, when he was a kid.
Well, I mean, poor and working class people lead interesting lives. And part of the difficulties in working for a daily newspaper when you're dealing with extremity crime and, you know, dry policy and politics is you don't get to spend time in these neighborhoods and understand that they have intellectual, cultural lives to hang out in these neighborhoods. Most New Yorkers, most reporters don't spend any of their time in low-income and working-class neighborhoods. So they have very little contact with what people's lives are really like in other parts of the city.
Jack, that wasn't the tradition. I mean, the beat reporter going out there doing everything. What happened here?
Well, at one point, New York had 7 or 8 daily newspapers, if you count the Brooklyn Eagle, and there was competition and diversity. But there have been cycles of interest in poverty. Jacob Riis wrote How the Other Half Lives in 1890. Mike Harrington wrote The Other America in 1962. Each of those books kind of rediscovered a poverty that has always existed. The poverty itself can become caught up in the fad and fashion cycles of culture.
Well, how does the national context all fit together here? I think clearly the issue of poverty was so connected with welfare in many people's minds. When that was fixed, successfully at least on the behalf of the conservatives and the Democrats, that was done. The issue was done. And we found that again and again, that even how we communicate with our donors had to change dramatically because welfare had changed the whole discussion. The fix of welfare and the elimination of welfare meant there was an expectation that a rising economy would deal with all problems. And I think now it's just beginning to we find resonance with many of our individual donors who are concerned about aspects that they know aren't working, healthcare, because people connect to that immediately. The working poor and the fact that they don't have enough income, minimum wage issues, those seem to connect.
Well, poverty, I think, has become sort of like AIDS in America.
Right.
It's become a very difficult to solve problem, but it's viewed now less as an acute issue. You know, Detroit isn't burning every night anymore, and more of a chronic issue that can be dealt with certain prescriptions. So I think most people sort of feel someone else is taking care of this, I don't have to worry about it.
And I think what's been true for the last 150 years is that the rich have gotten richer and the poor have gotten poorer, except for the 1930s and the New Deal and the 1960s and the war on poverty and the Great Society. But we're now living through a second Gilded Age. And certainly in the last 25 years, as this disparity in wealth and income has grown wider, it has not become a political issue. And I think that's a failure of political and labor leadership.
But I think there's another trend concurrent that also works against that, and that is people, in order to maintain their status in the middle class, to own a house, to pay for their commute, have to work twice as hard as they did in the past. So to a certain extent, I think it's made the mass middle of the American population less sympathetic to people who don't work as hard.
Right.
So I think that's a dynamic that, that's also played.
Well, I think that's a part of the Ronald Reagan welfare queen mythology, is that equating a lack of a work ethic with poverty, when in fact my experience is that poor people have a work ethic, and immigrants have a work ethic.
Increasingly, I think people are getting the notion that people aren't sitting around. I think the question is, I'm not sitting around, I'm struggling, and I think this comes up again and again. I can't really refocus on your issues until I get mine resolved. And I think it's that. I don't think people have become more, less moral or less concerned. I just don't think they can handle it with the way their own lives are going and the pace of their own lives. So we'll be right back to continue the urban agenda.
Can I ask a few questions about the apartment on Park Street?
What was your name?
My name is Juan Hernandez.
It's been rented.
Hello, my name is Sanjay Kumar. I am calling about the apartment on Park Street.
It just rented.
My name is Tyrone Washington. I'm calling about the apartment for rent on Park Street.
It's not available.
I use a wheelchair and...
It's gone.
Hello, my name is Graham Wellington. I'm calling about the apartment for rent on Park Street. Is that still available?
Yes, it is.
Oh, it is?
Housing discrimination is illegal. If you think you've been a victim, call us.
We're talking with journalist Jack Newfield, now a columnist with the New York Sun, and Glenn Thrush, who covers City Hall for Newsday. Before we get into the national issue, which I think has to be, the context for poverty obviously is always national, what about some of the other issues that are out there? Glenn, for instance, I know housing is something that has been a focus of Newsday and the rest.
Well, housing is sort of the canary in the coal mine in New York City. It's an indication of when neighborhoods are becoming dysfunctional and people aren't able to cope with their lives. And family homelessness has been the most, I think, sort of the most alarming trend in New York City over the past 5 years. The shelter population for families is soaring, and there's this whole unseen population of people who are living tripled and doubled up in each other's apartments because they simply can't afford housing.
Yeah, I don't think the image of homelessness it's beginning to permeate, but clearly for even my generation, homelessness was always associated with single men.
Right.
And the notion of family homelessness it's almost a secret in many it doesn't show itself on the streets.
And that's what's sort of ironic about it. Homelessness got a lot, Mayor Koch came up with this 10-year plan for homelessness based on squeegee men and guys living on grates. But in fact, we sort of have a more acute problem now with families, much more sympathetic population. But because they're more desperate to maintain a foothold on housing, because they use alternative, quote-unquote, informal ways of living, basically sleeping on people's couches, you don't see them, and there isn't a policy imperative to do anything about it.
And clearly this is just the beginning. With the loss of federal subsidies that are going for housing, whether that's Section 8. Right. There's a new Westchester decision that I don't know if you've heard about, which says basically the courts have supported the idea that landlords can opt out of accepting Section 8 vouchers. That's the end of the world. If you have about 33,000 apartments with Section 8 vouchers, most of them concentrated in New York City, if landlords can opt out of that program, either because they claim it's too cumbersome or they want to upgrade the people in their apartments so they can charge more rent, that would be devastating. But also Mitchell Llamas, which are converting now at an incredible pace. The 20-year sunset of the Mitchell Llama laws really hits middle to moderate income people with rent increases they can't pay.
And the current Bush budget cuts funding for Section 8 vouchers.
Block granting it.
New York City will probably lose about 10,000, and there's a waiting list of 150,000 for Section 8 vouchers, and the list was closed in 1995.
Well, we know. I keep remembering the number, 140,000 people waiting for public housing in NYCHA. Right. So you got all the... Have you heard from your City Hall experiences any discussion about this coming out of the mayor's office?
Well, the mayor has embarked on this initiative to create 60,000 units of affordable housing within the next, I think it is 6 years. We're not exactly certain whether or not that's stuff that was already in the pipeline or versus how much of it has been newly created. It is not, I would say, it is not a top priority of the administration, and there is not an enormous amount of local money that goes into this stuff anyway. A lot of this is done through federal tax credits and leveraging of state and federal funds. So it's something that can be generated through City Hall, but the resources have to be marshaled in Washington, and that's a huge problem right now.
And you get a different definition of, quote, affordable from different bureaucrats, and I think only about 5% of this is intended for homeless or near homeless families. Affordable could be people making $60,000 a year.
And one other addendum here. The mayor's big priority development-wise is obviously the West Side Stadium proposal, and he has proposed diverting $350 million of bond revenue from the Battery Park City Authority to the West Side development. That money, when it was initially created, the Battery Park City Authority was intended to create 80-20. 20% of that money.
Well, the homeless can live in the luxury boxes.
Well, we've been just as critical on the, obviously after 9/11, there was, billions of dollars put for the Lower Manhattan development. None of that has gone for moderate or low-income housing whatsoever, and all of those are subsidized money. And this is the first time we found that bonding, the federal bonding authority did not have the restriction that there had to be at least some modicum of moderate and low income. And they haven't.
And the Liberty bonds have excluded the Lower East Side and Chinatown and focused on Tribeca and Soho and more wealthy and affluent.
But we don't see a lot of...
that don't need the help that much.
I wouldn't want a poll done on New Yorkers on this one. I don't think that's penetrated the public's consciousnness.
I don't think it's... I'll go one step further. I don't think the public would substantially object to that. Look, the politics of distributing money is extremely important to the elected officials that dole it out. When you're talking about diverting money to a population that doesn't vote particularly and may not be represented in your district, as poor people are in many districts throughout the city, you're not talking about a political winning issue. The 90s, the big trend in development in the 90s was money going from low income to these sort of leverage deals for quote-unquote affordable, which largely amounted to bolstering African American, Latino, middle class communities. So there's not a lot of attention on low income.
Well, I think that's another dangerous myth here, that poor people don't vote. When poor people have somebody to vote for,
Right.
they vote. When Reverend Jackson ran in '88, there was a tremendous upsurge in black voting. In 2001, when Fernando Ferrer ran for mayor, the 28% of the vote was Latino, which was equivalent to their proportion of the population.
Yeah.
When people feel their vote will make a difference, they come out and vote.
Well, I guess CSS has done a lot of the nonpartisan voter registration in the city for a long time. And we've registered about 250,000 under Richie Perez, who just...
You should have a new voter registration
But I
drive in
think
honor of Richie Perez.
Yes, I think so. But the issue really gets to both your issues, that basically poor people are not even on the radar screen for many politicians, not only the ones representing affluent neighborhoods, but even those representing very neighborhoods with high concentrations. But the myth is that they never register is not true. But there has to be some galvanizing interest to get people moving.
Well, getting back to the media issue again,
Right.
I mean, in addition to sort of this political gerrymandering, creating these sort of districts which have a high concentration of African Americans, Latinos,
Right.
and a high concentration in some instances of poverty, you have sort of a media gerrymandering, where you have those communities are covered essentially when sensational crime happens, or for the occasional parachute drop, where you have 6 reporters coming and do a series on how awful stuff is. A lot of newspapers in the city view the larger proportion of the city as what they cover every day, and then these small fenced-off areas as places they occasionally go into.
Now, is that going to change? The demographics are racing ahead in this city. I mean, you know, I remember when I was working with Ed Koch, we used to visit some of the new emerging neighborhoods here. It's incredible what's going on in the city. And, you know, the question of who is their audience and what are they going to buy going forward, I think has to be of concern with the growth of the
I
Latino
think what
community.
we need is a high-quality black newspaper and a high-quality Spanish-language paper that will force, out of old-fashioned competition, the dailies and the tabloids to do a better job of covering the invisible people.
Do you think so?
Well, I would just settle for a high-quality newspaper,
Well, that's...
apart from my own, of course.
But, you know, we should close on the issue of the national media and poverty. I mean, clearly New York, perhaps more than any city in America, is dominated by national issues, both because of the money we get and because we're a national news capital, which clearly influences things. As this election begins to roll itself out, the national election, what issues around the working poor or the poor do you think are going to catch fire?
Well, I think the hidden hand choking New York is the Bush tax cut for the rich. And I remember a speech the late and lamented Senator Moynihan gave in the early 80s, which he called Starving the Beast, which is how the right-wing strategy is to starve the federal government of money so they have a rationale for not funding jobs, schools, healthcare, housing. They can't just say we're against it. So I think by this tax cut for the rich depletes the federal treasury of billions of dollars that should be going to the poor, and then they have an excuse: we can't afford to build housing.
I clearly there's some signs that is a policy, but how does that, translate down to a political issue that voters, a breadbasket political issue, people that are going to grasp? Do you have any sense of what?
Well, outsourcing. I think that is a huge political bandwagon for Democrats and for the left in general. And I think low-income communities are making, low-income politicians or groups representing low-income communities are making a big mistake if they don't jump onto that. I think you're tapping a lot of white middle-class anger in this country, and it'd be a good opportunity to sort of combine those two interests yet again.
Well, it seems like the minimum wage taps into some of those very issues you're talking about. There's a lot of
the
job
issue of
insecurity.
democracy, because there's a
Right.
the Assembly has already passed a bill. There's an overwhelming majority in the Senate to raise the minimum wage, and Pataki and Bruno are preventing it from coming to a vote, knowing if it came to a vote, it would pass overwhelmingly. And that's outrageous. But again, I think the city's religious leadership is abdicating its role in making this a bigger issue.
You don't see very many voices here. Perhaps I don't want to glorify the past.
Cardinal O'Connor was a union, guy. And when he came to the Daily News rally when we were on strike. You don't see this with Egan.
Glenn, anything in closing as to what you're seeing on the horizon?
Well, again, I think back to the outsourcing issue. I think John Edwards used it sort of successfully in the primary campaign, but it's going to be huge against Bush, particularly because they've sort of shot themselves in the foot on it.
Okay. Well, thank you both.
Thank you.
My thanks to reporters Jack Newfield and Glenn Thrush. I'm David R. Jones of the Community Service Society, and thank you for watching The Urban Agenda. To learn more about the work of the Community Service Society of New York or to comment on the Urban Agenda, please contact us at 212-614-5425 and on the web at www.cssny.org.